Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. Design and architecture are fields that always must live in context. They are not created from a void and then experienced in isolation. Architects, for example, must understand the scales around their work. On one side, you have the interior, and on the other side, you have the city or the environment. On top of that, there is a set of political, social, and economic conditions that can influence the work. Increasingly, design fields are tasked with navigating a complex series of systems and ideologies, and multidisciplinary work is ever more important. Yet, it can be hard to teach this type of interdisciplinarity. Departments and teams often exist on their own, research projects can get territorial, and academic institutions can produce a sort of sameness as faculty go up for tenure and seek to make their work legible to others. Despite being an environment for free research, academia, at times, especially in the design fields, can almost feel behind the industry. My guest today is someone who has thought a lot about these topics, alongside thinking a lot about how to structure institutions to set them up for this type of expansive research. For the last almost 30 years, Mohsen Mostafavi has led architecture and design programs with a focus on collaboration, expansive practices, and interdisciplinary research. From 2008 to 2019, he was the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Before that, he was the dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell University. And before that, he was the chairman of the Architectural Association in London. Mohsen's own research interests are diverse, spanning urbanization, architecture's relationship to the interior, ecologies and environmental concerns, as well as technologies and materials. In this conversation, Mohsen and I talk about leading institutions as a design project. We talk about the scales of design education and the increasing complexity around these fields, as well as his own interest in pursuing deeper and richer collaborations amongst designers. We start this conversation, however, with his latest project. Mohsen recently edited the first English translation of Manfredo Tafuri's Modern Architecture in Japan, which was just published by Mac Books. We talk about the importance of Tafuri's writing to Mohsen, how this connects to his larger current research, and why thinking about the future of cities connects all of his interests. I've been an admirer of Mohsen's work for a long time, so this was a real treat to have him on the show. If you like this episode and what we do here at Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus interviews, they get full transcripts of every episode, an exclusive monthly newsletter, and more. Head over to patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up and get immediate access and help support the ongoing production of Scratching the Surface. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Mohsen Mostafavi. I want to start actually sort of very briefly talking about one of your latest projects you just edited from Mac Books. The photography book publishers just launched an architecture vertical. And one of the first books was a book that you edited from the first English translation of Manfredo Tafuri's Modern Architecture in Japan. And your research and your work is expansive. It's about materiality, it's about technology, it's about urbanization, it's about ecology, it's about landscape and climate. I'm wondering about Tafuri's and modern architecture in Japan. How does this fit into your interests, or what is it about this text and this work that sort of fits into your larger sort of critical project?
So the book of Manfredo Tafuri is really part of a much bigger research project that I've been working on for the last 3 years. I'm in my third year or 3 years, and it's a research project that is focusing primarily on Japan and the future, essentially, of Japanese urbanization. With that in mind, I've been collaborating with a number of colleagues in Japan, but I also work with a few people here at the GSD, including some former students, some current students, and we produce a website which is called japanstory.org,
Mm.
under the rubric of Japan story, taking a kind of clue from the Japanese film director Yasujiro Uzu's well-known film Tokyo
Yeah,
Story.
yeah.
And we we on this website have examples of our publications, examples of our design research, translations, etc., etc. And I would be happy to go into it more. But essentially, we have been also translating publications, mainly from Japanese text
Mm.
to English. But this text of Manfredo Tafuri is from Italian to English, and it's basically because of the fact that there is very little writing that has been done on Japanese architecture and urbanism in a way post World War II. There's plenty of stuff on,
Hmm.
contemporary architects, Toyo Ito and Sana and
Hmm.
So Fujimoto and all these architects who are doing great work, but very little that really looks at the sort of the most recent history of Japanese architecture and urbanization. And Tafuri wrote this book more or less as part of a guidebook in the early 1960s, and we can discuss it more. But I was very enthusiastic about arranging for a translation and editing it and writing something in terms of situating this book. Um, so it's the initial motivation to answer your question is because it actually relates to other work that I'm doing on Japan and on the nature of Japanese architecture and especially urban space.
I want to come back to the larger project about kind of Japanese urbanism, but I have one more question about the book specifically, and I think it's interesting what you're saying about how little writing there is about that sort of post-war Japanese architecture era. And I'm wondering if thinking about publishing this book today, translating this today in 2023, and you're working on a project thinking about the future of urbanism in Japan, what are some connections between what he was writing in the 60s and what you're researching and working on looking forward? What do you gain, or what did you find in looking back that's kind of pushing things forward?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Lots of things. When I came across the text, I thought what was interesting in a way was how Tafuri did a book that was much more simple, much more straightforward
Right.
than anything else than he did. Because for those who are familiar with Tafuri's writing, he is a very complex writer, even or especially in Italian. The writing can sometimes be convoluted, it's quite complex.
Hmm.
And also, interestingly enough, he probably, well, I know that he probably afterwards wouldn't quite approve of this book. Uh, and part of it is that it's a book essentially about history and criticism,
Hmm.
and really writing from the perspective of an architect about a body of work in Japan, which he at that time that he wrote the book, uh, he wasn't even yet 30. He was very uh, in awe, in some ways, interested, enthusiastic about this body of work. And this is something that he wouldn't uh, wouldn't do, 10 or
Hmm.
15 years or 20 years later, where he became very critical of criticism as a field, and said there's only history and no criticism. And
Right.
so I was personally interested in Tafuri as a critic in some ways, but Tafuri as someone who also uses writing in relation to contemporary practice, because he was also writing this thing um, at a time when he was part of the younger generation of Italian architects and was aware of and involved with the group of so-called avant-garde practitioners. But he also had he was moving towards becoming a full-time or very serious historian, and this book was part of that process, part of that project of
Right.
him trying to become a historian. So I've just found the book in a way, on one level, interesting because it provides a certain level of knowledge and certain level of presentation and analysis
Yeah.
that is not so easily available. It's positioning itself uh, in a kind of interesting way in relation to the rest of the work of Manfredo Tafuri. And in some ways, he also uses this text in order to see a kind of parallelism in a
Right.
way between avant-garde practices in Italy and Europe and the work of the metabolists. So I think all of those things have very interesting aspects to them. But you asked me specifically. You asked the question specifically.
Yeah,
When
I'm
why
interested in this sort of the history as it relates to the future, and if
yeah
there are things,
yes
what I think, I guess maybe I was sort of asking you a leading question there, which you've started to hint at. What's interesting to me about this text is that it does draw these parallels to his Italian context, and I'm wondering if you were seeing parallels between a contemporary context in 2023.
yes, I think that in a variety of ways. Part of it is that I'm personally not in total agreement with Tafuri's criticism
Hmm.
of criticism of
Hmm.
Tafuri's
Yeah.
criticism of operative criticism. So in my own work, I've actually tried to use um, writing as a form of thinking, or as a way
Right.
of sort of imagining its relationship to architectural practice. And I don't quite agree with Tafuri's sort of dismissive tone, especially later on. So this particular book, in a
Yeah.
way, is does provide a certain level of inspiration because of the way that it kind of tries to analyze the the nature of practice at that time. And I think we also have been doing that.
Mm,
We also had been reflecting in a way on what has happened, both post World War II, but also in terms of contemporary practice. That's one side of it. But I think the other way that this work is also interesting is in terms of its parallel. Since we didn't find so many publications, there are really two or three reasonably good ones, but some of them fairly brief. We
mm,
then embarked on trying to use not not only writing but also drawing,
mm,
um, by which I mean design research,
yeah.
design drawings that would be also a form of history writing, by essentially understanding the morphology, the history of the development of Japanese urbanization, specifically focusing on Tokyo at the beginning of our research, and to see how architectural drawings, for example, could be
Right.
used to understand the nature of architectural development, especially since the
Yeah.
1960s.
Yeah.
So we kind of start more or less from the period that Tafuri finishes or ends with, but we also look at, let's say, the work of Tange.
Mm,
He
mhm.
never got to include the Olympic Stadium, but we look at sort of those those parts of the city and their evolution, their development, the nature of their growth. So we use the past in some ways as a way to help us think through what the future project of the city might be. But not only through writing, which Tafuri does, we actually do it through drawings,
Right.
which are sort of analyzing the relationship between history, between the past and the future. And I think, broadly speaking, this question of understanding the past as a way to be in the present, to be projective with the future, is sort of part and parcel of how we work, how what the nature of this research is, and some of the things that I'm personally interested in as well.
Well, let me ask you this then, because one of the big projects that you initiated when you were dean at Harvard was the future of the American city, and that started with Miami, and then I think you did L.A., Detroit, Boston, and so it's interesting now hearing about thinking about the future of the Japanese city. I have two questions about that. One, I'm interested in what is it about sort of future urbanism or future cities that interests you so much? And then how does this new project sort of connect to what you were doing when you were thinking about American cities?
What is exciting, specifically about the question of urbanization in relation to architecture, because I'm not really only studying urbanization. I'm studying, or I'm interested in the intersection of the architectural space
Yeah, that was
and
my
the
next question.
yeah. So maybe I give you a quick answer,
Okay,
and
yeah.
then you can ask a kind of
Okay.
longer question. We can go into it. So I think with this particular thing, I, in a way, as architects, um, uh, it's really important for us to be working within the context of certain societal transformations, societal issues,
Mm,
and it's impossible in a way to understand the roles and responsibilities of architecture without understanding it or without examining it in relation to the question of urbanization. And we've seen in the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years, at times, a sort of disappearance of the discussion of the urban or urbanization, um, specifically in relation to the architectural.
yeah.
And I think keeping that tension alive, I don't want to be only working at the urban scale, but constantly working at these multiple scales of the small scale, the really
Hmm.
small scale, and then understanding that within the context of the question of urbanization seems to be absolutely critical in a way. And um, to go back to Tafuri for a second, I think that even at that time, age 29, it's very clear that we're dealing with someone who has a deep uh, investment, interest, commitment to the political, in a
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
And I think that today, for us, one of the ways in which we try to deal, for example, with the future of the Japanese forms of urbanization is really to also understand this social political realities,
Yeah.
social political, economic, cultural realities of Japanese society and its engagement, its connections to the architectural. And I think that will enable us. That has helped us understand the role of architects and architecture within this sort of bigger context. And so it's with that in mind that the future of the American city project also became, in a way, relevant and urgent, partly because I felt that as a school, the GSD was involved with lots and lots of different locations, lots of geographies around the world. And even though we did and we do lots of studios, research projects focusing on the US, but we didn't really have the same kind of formal research, pedagogical discourse, if you like, in relation to that. So we had a series of opportunities, and I think the future of the American city was really one way to try and suggest that the American city also deserves this sort of specific
Yeah.
attention, and it needs to be bracketed as opposed to like lots of studios. One is in this city, one is in that town, and things like that. So that's how we started, and frankly, the main focus in terms of my project has been primarily on Miami, even though we have, of course, been working on other
Mm,
cities, and the Office for Urbanization that's led by Charles Waldheim has been documenting, some of the
right,
other
right.
material through discussions, conversations, podcasts, and things like that as well. Yeah.
Let's go back to that sort of intersection of architecture and urbanism question for a second. And I want to maybe expand that. And I'll be honest, I'm not totally sure how to ask this question. So I'm going to talk a little bit and hopefully a sort of question comes through, or something that you can kind of think through with me. Because what's interesting to me about your work is, yes, you are looking at how architecture sort of connects to this larger context of urbanization, which I think you also write about in your intro to the Tafuri book about his interest in architecture at the scale of the city. But you also seem to be interested in not just scales outward, but scales inward. And I'm thinking about the Harvard Design Magazine issue about what about the inside, and you were interested in interiors and how we talk about interiors. I know sort of early in your tenure there, you were engaged in conversations around interior design programs and industrial design programs and smaller scales. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about sort of architecture as it relates to these other disciplines going up, scaling up and scaling down, and how you sort of think through that increased sort of interdisciplinarity there about how we think about architecture and design. Do you know what I mean there?
Yes, oh, absolutely. I think it's a really, and in fact, you put it very well. It's a sort of, it's something that I feel very strongly about, because I think more and more, as you know, we have this kind of division between
Hmm.
interior design, architecture, urban, and the scale seems to be also producing different levels of expertise and different
Right.
levels of specialization. And in a way, architects used to work very much across a range of scales, from the scale of the room and pieces of furniture. So many of the avant-garde architects were also designing, pieces of furniture
Hmm.
that are still in production, and all that. So it's true that, in fact, my very, very first and last issues of Harvard Design Magazine were both on
Oh, right.
the inside. So the first one was called "What About the Inside?" One, what about the inside? It was basically the last one, and I think that in the context of design education, in the context of schools of architecture, we never have done enough
Mm,
to look at the interior, to look at the inside, and yet, ironically, the vast majority of architects, and especially sole practitioners, end up doing nothing else but
right.
interiors and
Right.
insides and restorations and renovation and things like that. And
Right.
slowly that is coming to schools, but schools have always been about exteriority, about the outside, about the picturing of of architecture as something that's always new, not so much about modification, not so much about adaptive reuse, not definitely not so much about the question of the interior. So I think this issue of scales is something that is very evident every time we think, for example, about the Japanese house or
Hmm.
about Japanese architecture. So many of the more recent interesting projects by Japanese architects are really dealing with very small scale homes, and where, because of the scale, there is a level of inventiveness
Right.
that is required, often expressed through the handling of the section of the building, which is really discussing a kind of lifestyle. And the house, the home, is really the manifestation of
Mm,
these different types of living. And in fact, it's worthwhile that even Tafuri kind of shows at the beginning, you know, some diagrams, for example, of Japanese interior chest of drawers. There's a famous kind of Japanese writer who spent time in Germany and produced these books about the Japanese house and about the Japanese interior. So, in some ways, the city, the urbanization uh, provides a context in terms of the multitude, in terms of the many, in terms of the collective, in
mm,
terms of the relationships, social relationships between people, between individuals, and the domestic environment, the smaller scale, the interior is much more about certain forms of subjectivity, certain forms of individual expression, different positions, different types of life in a way, and the diversity of those, and the accommodating those kinds of diversity seems to be key. And this is a different position, it's a different approach, it's a different posture to the anonymity of mass-produced living, of things being
right.
all the same, of sameness. So now we have, a sort of emphasis and desire really for accommodating difference, but still within the context of a larger collective, within the context of a bigger thing. So it's not, for me, it's not just about individuality, about personal self expression only, but it's really this relationship between the one and the many, the
Yeah.
single and the multitude. And I think the scale question allows you to go from the interior to the city, from the person in a way to the citizen. And I think those are seem to be relevant, um,
Yeah.
both in terms of everyday life, but also in terms of the academy. Because, for example, the academy is not necessarily organized to think in those ways or to think in
Yeah.
those terms, So,
That was my next question. I was sort of interested in how this way of thinking about architecture, and we could perhaps even expand that to say thinking about architecture and design, how that manifests itself in educational settings. There's this thinking in scales, both up and down. There's this sort of blurring of disciplines. Actually, in that episode, in your episode of the Future of American City podcast, where they interviewed you, you talked about designers being kind of conversation conveners and sort of like taking on this activist role, which is, very much in line with what you're talking about now. How does architecture and design education start to accommodate these both larger sort of mandates for designers, while also this sort of increased complexity of the projects themselves?
well, often that happens as a matter of a kind of chronology of design education,
Yeah.
because in a way people often start with smaller things and more
Ah,
focused, and then the complexity of the scale increases and the size of the project sometimes increases as they go along. And um, at times it's hard for people to return to the time when they were doing smaller scale things or
uh,
focusing on something that's detailed, because of sometimes, I don't think it's not, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there does seem to be a sort of linear thing
yeah.
linked to scales of complexity, and therefore the scale and size of a project from the first year of architecture to the fifth year if people are in a BArch program, or from first to third or fourth years if they're in a master's program. And that's one aspect. But I think that by putting the emphasis on the interior, for example, by dealing with social, political issues, by dealing with urban and architectural issues. I think my attempt while I was dean was to basically create or have a school which is was sort of often constructed under the rubric of transdisciplinary
Yeah.
practices and
Yeah.
trying to think about the way in which different fields basically also could work together and different kinds of knowledge were important. This, after all, is how many contemporary practices
Yeah.
work. But
Yeah.
ironically, the academy sometimes, which is supposed to be where research is happening and where there's a certain level of kind of experimentation and so on, uh, at times it's behind uh,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
contemporary practice, because contemporary practice deals with certain contingencies, certain
Right.
realities, certain demands, and the structure of the academy is often organized through departments. Departments produce expertise. The expertise and knowledge of the departments at times produces certain forms of self-preservation that makes it harder to start thinking across fields. At times, it makes it harder for people who are working across one or more, two or more disciplines
Hmm.
to be accepted and gain, let's say, certain level of recognition which is necessary within the academy. So the academy occasionally can have this strange effect of creating borders and boundaries
Uh-huh.
between disciplines, which sometimes in practice, or often these days in practice, is necessary to overcome. Of course, I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but I think there is a certain grain of truth to what I've experienced. Therefore, to try and organize the academy, try and set up the circumstances of pedagogy in such a way that faculty, researchers are working across different disciplines, not just only in design and architecture and landscape, but also with other disciplines, in the humanities
Right.
and in the sciences and in fields like governance and topics like that. I think that's very exciting and that's very productive. Um, but it's often hard. You would think it
Yeah.
would be easy, but it's often hard to orchestrate those because people have their teaching and they have their commitments and they have their courses and they have their responsibilities. So
Right.
anything new becomes something that needs new resources, needs money, needs funding, needs time, means a kind of deviation from what people are doing. So it's at times harder to achieve. But I think we had a very productive number of years and had a reasonable amount of success, for which I'm grateful to those people who were willing to kind of
Yeah.
give it a go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right, though, and I think I may have actually said this to your successor, Sarah Whiting, when she was on the show, because we talked a little bit about sort of transdisciplinary narrative also, and that's really easy to sort of talk about and to want, but then in practice it becomes much more territorial. And I
Mhm.
think even on the sort of faculty level, there's this sort of impulse and need to make your work legible for committees, for promotion, for tenure. And sometimes when you start to work interdisciplinarily, that becomes a lot harder to do because you're sort of crossing these different things. But let's talk for a second about sort of administration and organizing the academy, because you're someone interesting to me, because you were the dean at Harvard for almost 11 years. Before that, you were the
Almost 12
dean.
years. Sorry to interrupt.
Almost 12 years. Oh, yeah, almost
Because
12
now,
years.
well, when you get to that moment, every month counts. So I
Right.
don't
You
want
were
to
counting.
discount. Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. You were the dean at Harvard for almost 12 years. You were dean at Cornell's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning.
Yes.
And then before that, you were the chair of the Architectural Association in London. And so this is almost 25 years of administration, of running schools. And I'm curious, A, sort of how you thought about administration in the context that we're talking about, in the context of transdisciplinary practices, in the context of scales. It seems like everything you're talking about architecturally also applies to designing an institution. Did you think about those positions as design projects?
Yes, absolutely. And the fact that they were all very different, and that I never for a moment made the mistake. I made mistakes, but I never made the mistake of assuming that I had some kind of a template for um, what you're calling administration. Um, I actually never thought about it um, as purely administration or as
Ah,
administration anyway. What I thought, um, because before going to the AA, I actually was well, I was at the AA. I studied there. I
right, right.
I then at Harvard, I was the director of the MR one program, of the architecture program. So I really was lucky to get a certain experience um, here before going to the AA to be the head of the AA, and I think at that time I had to really think about the AA as a school, the limitations of that institution, the structure of the faculty, the hiring, their
Mhm.
employment terms are nothing to do with what exists at Harvard.
Right.
And so I had to really work within a very different kind of environment. At the same time, that environment, despite, let's say, a lot of financial resources, had and has incredible, amazing
Yeah.
possibilities and potentials, because it's so different in a
Right.
way than what happens within the context of the American Academy, where I had trained there and I was teaching there, where all my studios were 1 year long. I
Mm.
invariably together the studios that I taught with others. We had students that were there with us for 2 years. That's a very long duration by American standards
Yeah.
for a student to spend with one faculty member. But that was in the context of a 5 year program, and so basically I had to design or redesign uh, the structure of the AA, because we'd also, you know, ended a very, very important and productive period with one of my predecessors, Alvin
Mhm.
Boyarsky, who had been super successful, and it's hard when you also go in after someone like that, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was relatively young at that point, and to try and organize a different idea of an institution that thought of itself as being avant-garde. And part of it was really for me to question in some ways the certain assumptions made by
Mhm.
the institution, certain ideas that people had about the institution and things like that. And I think we made the organization much more European in a way for a period of time, very diverse, very much engaged with questions of future practice,
Mhm. Mhm.
and not only doing in a way utopian or visionary projects, but also engaging with some of the world's most important and interesting people who've become now. I mean, if I go through the list of people
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
we hired at that time, and I sort of invited them to teach, and where they are and who they are, and my students and my colleagues. I think it's a wonderful kind of period. And when I went to Cornell, it's a in upstate New York in Ithaca, a group of faculty who are amazing, but they'd also been teaching there for a very, very long time. They were not going anywhere. It's very difficult to change the American system just because of this system of
Right.
hiring and things like that. It's not a criticism of anything or anyone, but that change is complicated when when you have a lot of people who basically are full time
Yeah.
tenured faculty and things like that. Whereas in London, it was relatively easy at that
Right.
time to change, the characters or the teachers or the direction of pedagogy. So you have to think differently. And in Cornell, I relied a lot more on the role of shorter term visitors and the collaboration between the full time and longer term. And so essentially, I'm agreeing with you that this was really a kind of design issue. It's not an administration thing. Administration is part of it, but I had to really think about what kind of work could this institution produce,
Right.
what would be interesting directions to pursue, and to really design that, as you put it, to kind of think about it as a particular project that would be done or realized during a very limited or particular time period. Because again, as an administrator, you don't. It's not like it's not something you want to do or achieve for an institution over a 30-year period.
Right.
Generally, there's a 5-year framework, and maybe you do another 5 years or something like that. But that's really, it's a bit like the contemporary politics. People are mayors of a town for 4 years, and
Yeah.
they want to build everything, or they want to do everything in the first 4 years, so that they have a chance of
Right. Right.
being reappointed. And being dean is a little bit like that as well. The question of a very limited time frame, and realizing things and achieving things within within a particular time frame, is quite important. At Harvard, I had the chance and to really connect the school with other schools at Harvard, which I, you know, I really
Yeah.
frankly didn't have enough time. I wasn't at Cornell for that long. It was a relatively short tenure there, before I moved back to Harvard. But here, just getting the chance to work with colleagues in
Right.
different schools, and being able to set up, a new design engineering program, for example, with the engineering school, and things like that. It was very different opportunities than I had, let's say, in London. But then in London, I was able to do other things with publications, with research platforms like Hook Park and things like that, which is a different story.
I'm kind of interested both in, I want to hear a little bit about what you were thinking about in 1995 and when you took the job at the AA, and what you're thinking about now. And that sort of that balance is not the right word, but I'm interested in sort of, you know, your own scholarship, your own interest, while also um, trying to elevate the interest and scholarships of everyone else, and sort of how you thought about that balance. And now that you don't have to do that for the first time in a long time, how that has shifted what you focus on and how you work.
Yeah, well, I mean, in 1995, which now is a long, long time ago,
I know, I'm sorry.
I had to. I was, as I said, I was relatively young, and I was thrown into this situation where I was really thinking about uh, the building of an institution,
Mm,
which requires a certain level of self-sacrifice, and uh, the, the idea of sort of support for other people,
right.
and the support for the project. Like, what kind of work do you want to produce? or you want this institution to produce. And and I think I was very focused on that. Plus the fact that I was very focused, and I have been, and that has been probably one of my I don't know, weaknesses or faults, or maybe
Mm,
sometimes it hasn't been bad. Is but I was very interested in means of communication, how
mm,
institutions also communicate. So it's one thing, you doing something or working on something, but it's also another thing to find a way to let the
yeah.
world know what you're
Yeah.
doing, and the status, the consequence of being able to communicate your ideas was very, very important for me. And so we invested an enormous amount on exhibitions and publications,
Yeah.
producing all sorts of publications. Many of them, have become collectors'
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
pieces
I've tried to buy some of
since
them.
then. Yeah, so it's really, we've been very, very lucky
Yeah.
to kind of, but to take that also seriously, to not think about it as some kind of vanity project or coffee table book. So
Right.
I never thought that really super famous architects, they needed me or the AA or whatever to do more promotion for them. So I think we were really interested in ideas, things that were not so well known, and in a way, the construction of new forms of knowledge through publications, exhibitions,
Yeah.
etc. And I think that up until a few years ago, when I was still dean, we really continued that type of practice, albeit in a different way. Here, we um, did try to think about, the question of research
Hmm.
and the question of how you build new forms of knowledge. And at Harvard, for example, one way we did that was by thinking about the impact that we would have around the world. That
Mm.
wasn't so much part of a project. The AA clearly um, had a lot of visibility at that time. And I remember even when we used to do the end of year projects review books and things like that, they always sold out, in Asia and places like that. So clearly there were students and younger architects and things like that who knew about what we were doing. But we weren't necessarily
Right.
in the world so much outside of London and Europe. I think at Harvard, my aim was to be much more geographically diverse, to be in a way much more a global school. Not, I don't mean that we were trying to be international and in a way, sell our wares to or products, or go
Right. Right.
and be kind of like putting our stamp around. It was really to develop a more humble um, position and modes of practice where we were very keen on sort of understanding what we could learn, how we could contribute, who were the people in these different geographies. So starting a whole number of research initiatives from uh, obvious places like China and India to the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and Latin America, and so many unexpected kind of geographies and places, and to then develop a research platform within a design school. So in the US, we're very used to knowing that there is money for sciences, but there is very little money in a way for the humanities or art and design. And part of our fundraising motivations or initiatives also linked to the idea of approaching people who would be interested in our research project, and then that would allow our students to also travel and be in places and produce a body of work. So the initiative to create sort of very targeted and building on previous kind of experiences of the institution, 3-year research projects that produce a series of publications. We could demonstrate our outcome, but we were dealing with these questions of urbanization, architecture in various places. I think that was what, part of your point about the redesign or the design of institutions.
I'll just ask you my last question, which is what I used to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Oh my God, I'm sort of reading a lot of very different things. So this question means that I actually I can answer a little bit. Also, the part of the previous question that I
Okay.
didn't answer. I mean, just because my reading, basically, a lot of it is directly connected to some of the things that I'm
Right.
working on. So I think after stepping down, one of the greatest things that I've been able to do is really to devote serious time to my own
Right.
research and writing, and to be selfish. I think I did do a lot of publications when I was at the AA,
Yeah.
or when I
Yeah.
was dean here. So I wasn't one of the kind of typology of. This is why I said I also didn't quite think of myself as an administrator, or
Yeah.
purely as an administrator, because I think a lot of people go into administration and then that's the end of their productive kind of life. I
Right.
think that
Right.
I try to continue that, and I think since I stopped, it's been really to kind of really realize that I haven't had the sort of time that I want
Yeah.
for a very long time. So there's an urgency, and I'm working on a variety of different things. So part of it is on Japan, but part of it is also on this American city, on Miami,
Mm.
that's sort of um, happening. And then there's a bunch of other projects that link to my interest on histories of the present, which is one of the courses that I teach. And I am
Mhm.
currently doing a research project with a couple of GSD students and other people on the work of a French Moroccan architect that came out of one of my courses. So this takes us to questions of colonialism,
Mhm.
post-colonialism, independence, the before and after. Is the architecture during colonialism worse, better, more interesting, less interesting? What happens? What are these
Oh,
countries
interesting.
that have
Yeah.
gone through a project of independence are doing? And as most of Africa went through a sort of discussion or a procedure of independence a lot of it between the 1950s and the mid 1970s. So this is very interesting, and I'm sort of dying to know more about
Mhm.
the whole issue of of being under the influence, being under
Right.
the rule of a colonial empire, and then being free of that, and the pros and cons of these kinds of things. So I read things related to that quite a bit.
Okay.
Lots of things related to Japan, and I read a lot of Japanese novels, especially
Ah.
by by Japanese women novelists. So in one of my classes, I focus a lot on contemporary Japanese women writers and novelists. So I read those things, and I also read trash. I read I read if I can. I read European detective stories just to switch off, and things of that sort. So
I love it.
it's really, really varied. It's not, I don't have a single sort of theme that I'm working on, but it's certainly enjoyable.
My favorite answers to those questions are when it is the sort of trash European spy novel or
Yeah,
something, and it's not just some architecture book or design theory or something.
yeah.
This was such a delight. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm a longtime admirer of your work. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you so much for your time.
This episode was recorded on March 22nd, 2023. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Service Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.